An African woman's story of divorce in Kenya. Read by Shibero, Akatsa. Chapter 4. Oppressed by the local authorities. At first, I was reluctant to take my case to court because I was struggling with the reality of our situation. And finally, a lawyer friend advised me that I needed to take it to court. I went back to the police station in my area and asked for the P3 form. I hadn't a clue what it was. I found out that it was a form you completed when you'd been involved in any situation that causes you injury. I was to complete this form and then take it to the main police station where the form was to be signed by the police doctor. The station was about 20 minutes from where we lived. It was a long, tedious process. I had to be on the line, or the queue, by 3:30 in the morning because the lines got very long. I would dress our daughter up in her school clothes, wrap her up in a sleeping bag, and off we would go. I'd leave her sleeping in the car, which was near enough for me to keep checking on her. On our way back from the station, I'll drop her off at school and pick her up again after school at 3:30. The first 2 times at the station, I was unsuccessful. The third time of lining up in the cold, I finally got to see the doctor, who appeared to be nursing a hangover, while he certainly stank of it. Walking away with a completed form, I was shocked to read that my injuries were rated the step before murder. After taking the form to be signed off, I returned to the police station that had registered my case. I needed to do this so that the policeman and I could go and identify the perpetrator. The policeman got into my car and we drove to where my husband now lived. I pointed out the house and sat and waited. I asked the policeman if they were going to go and see if he's in, and they said, "Nah, not today." But they would come back the following day without me. Next day, I returned to the police station and asked about my case and if my husband was there for me to identify him, as was required and as I had been told. I was told that it was okay, I need not worry about this, that they had dealt with the case. As I left the police room, one of the policemen escorted me outside and asked me if I had anything to give him that would hasten the case. I looked at him and told him bluntly that I would not give him anything. He didn't like that at all. I then left. The next day, I was at the station again. This time, I was led into a dingy little room where 3 male policemen were waiting for me. One of them began to speak. He asked me to call off the case since it was not of a domestic nature, and these things were happening all the time. That actually it was a domestic. I sat and listened quietly. I was scared. These guys were huge and hovering all over me. I told them that I was not going to drop my case. On hearing this, they tried another strategy, that of discrediting my witness statement. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I could see that they were getting frustrated and their body language reeked of anger, but I stood my ground as they hovered around me. It was frightening and intimidating. I was alone with 3 policemen in a closed room who were on a mission to throw my case out of the window, and I was not cooperating. Common sense told me to get out of the room. I took a deep breath and told them calmly that I'd come to identify the man who had battered me as they had told me the day I came to report the case. Yet I could not see him anywhere. There was silence. I decided I had done what needed to be done. I stood up, ready to leave. I walked to the door, and as I exited, I turned and told them, "As God is my witness, The truth shall set me free. Gosh, I got some very blank looks. I knew God was fighting for me. God was the only one I could trust. I left the room. I hadn't realized just how much I was shaking until I got inside. I had heard enough horror stories from women about their experiences with the police, especially those of a domestic nature. 2 days later, my story was in one of the dailies. The case had reached the courts. He pleaded not guilty, but was found guilty of battering and almost killing me, of which he spent time in prison. The secret is out. Though I had made the decision to get divorced a little earlier before being battered, the battering was the final straw that clinched the decision for me. And now our family secret was out. No more hiding about the reality of our marital relationship. So much for the perfect couple that many people had seen us to be. I was so glad I didn't have to live with that facade anymore. I remember telling my late father what had happened. He had been lost for words. I'd heard the emotion in his voice. He couldn't take it in. That our marriage had escalated to such a level of degradation. I heard the helplessness in his voice as I tearfully told him what had happened and my intentions to separate and divorce my husband. My mother just had no words. It was such a shock and a pain to my parents and some of my siblings because I'd never breathed a word about the state of my marriage to them. I believed I had friends, especially in the church I used to go to. I was sadly disappointed. My true friends emerged. They were less than a handful and not from my church. Those were gone as soon as the news came out of what had happened. Most of these friends from church had told me to keep up appearances and not rock the boat because I was talking about what had happened. I stopped being invited to lunches and dinners and other family events. I was alone and became a recluse. But my faith grew stronger. Chapter 5. Abandoned by my church. We had been attending our home church as a family for close to 8 years. I was glad that I had a church family. We were well known and I had been an active member involved in a number of ministries. I enjoyed going to church because I felt as a family we belonged to this church because we were accepted. After being battered, I was very vulnerable. So was my daughter. And we felt glad that at least I had a church family that I could turn to for spiritual support, comfort, and friendship. Every Sunday, the church staff always put a banner along the road which claimed unity in walking with each other through life. So, in the state I was in, I turned to my home church. Here I was, seeking refuge from my church. My final physical separation from my husband had left me mentally and physically scarred. All I needed in this state was compassion and walking together with my church family as the banner loudly proclaimed along the main road. But it never came. I went to see the leadership team, some of whom had also been divorced. Nobody felt they could counsel me or even pray or see us as a family. I was avoided like the plague. This was not because they didn't know about my current situation. They did, because I'd made it to a point to let them know what was going on in my marriage. Through the 8 years of legally separating, not surprisingly, my then husband continued to serve in the very same church, like all was well. There were even times he would go to the same church with other women like it was normal and okay. And this was totally accepted by the church leaders. Yet, we were still married and our daughter often saw what her father was doing and so did a number of people at the church. He continued in ministry. During this period, God kept on bringing hurting women on the same road my way, with stories of how they had been judged, traumatized, rejected, and stigmatized, in addition to being marginalized within their own home churches. This broke my heart. Majority of the women witnessed their ex-husbands being supported by their churches, allowed to carry on in ministries like mine had been, and just as I'd experienced, carrying on life outside the church like nothing had happened. Yet many of these women were, like myself, being the victims in their marriages and divorce cases, and had to quietly and shamefully slip away to find other churches for refuge. My experiences in my church as a woman going through divorce was common with most women. It's a man's world for most churches. With my experience and that of a large majority of women going through divorce, it became clear that many women face overt, oppressive, patriarchal, and negative traditional attitudes within churches, the legal systems, and the local authorities in Kenya. I was not the only one. In my need to understand if there were any churches that provided family support to hurting families, many of whom were women, victims, I set out to visit a number of churches in Nairobi. Not surprisingly, few churches were not even willing to talk about the realities of divorce, having invaded families in Kenyan churches, except for one church at the time. I was frowned upon, I was avoided, appointments were made but not kept. How dare I, a woman, even bring up the subject of separation and divorce? The churches I visited were not ready to come out and talk about ways in which they have a responsibility to have a church ministry that walks with breaking families. There was a general belief that if a church provides spiritual support, they would be supporting and encouraging divorce. Heaven forbid. One church didn't even have the courtesy to talk to me, and instead sent me to their website to read what their beliefs are on divorce and remarriage. I wasn't surprised to read at all about the heavy stand taken on divorced women and remarriage. Yet many a divorced man had been remarried in that particular church soon after their divorce. The women had had to leave the church as her ex-husband carried on in ministry. Not surprisingly, most churches in most Kenya remarry divorced men without hesitation, but condemn women for wanting to remarry, and most will not entertain remarrying divorced women. Yet behind closed doors, I met pastors, male pastors, who admitted that this was a very big issue within their churches, with some of these pastors quietly going through divorce secretly and remarrying soon after. There were also a number of women married to pastors who suffered silently in devastating abusive marriages with their pastor husbands, as they sat quietly dying in their roles as pastors' wives because divorce is a taboo subject. I thought, what a shame. And then there were divorced women pastors who wouldn't talk about support for hurting families at all. Ironically, there were also male pastors who continued to have extramarital affairs with women in the same church congregation, some of whom were married as they were, while at the same time seen to be supporting the traumatized women's husbands. Continued. Where are all these women and hurting families expected to turn to for help if not their home church? It's much easier to marry couples off, but the true test is actually walking with couples when the family has reached breaking point. That's where God's love truly comes through. Compassion and love is needed mostly for families in this season, not legalism and oppression, nor denial of the numbers of families affected by divorce within the churches, with women and children as major victims. If I had had my church walk with us as a family, I wonder, would we still have been together in a better place today? And that is the end of the reading for today. Join me next week in Chapter 6, Sexual Harassment from My Divorced Lawyer.